Okay, thank you so much. What I'm going to be talking about tonight is leadership required for building a disciple-making church. And as Pastor Francis mentioned earlier, I have backslided very badly, so much so that I've left full-time calling. No, I'm just kidding. I spent 20 years in the corporate world and then 15 years pastoring, and I'm in my third season. So I have my own little company called Third Well Consulting, and I do leadership and team learning, coaching, and mentoring. I am a certified coach with the International Coaching Federation. I'm an associate facilitator and coach with the Center for Creative Leadership, a certified facilitator and coach with the Chartered Institute for Personnel and Development. And I do my own freelance coaching and learning business. And last I checked, I'm still ordained as a reverend in the Evangelical Free Church of Singapore. But at the end of the day, I'm still a pastor at heart. So that's just a little bit about me. So there's this book called The Simple Church, and the author Tom Rainer and Eric Geiger said this: many of our churches have become cluttered, so cluttered that people are busy doing church instead of being the church. Actually, this is not a new slide. Those who have were in the same exchange last year, I've shared this slide as well. And I wanted to recall back from what I did last year. And last year I said, in discipleship in a church, one of the things that we as leaders have to do is to design a discipleship process and cultivate discipleship communities with the opportunities for spiritual experiences and shared discipleship journeys. Now, I highlighted the words design because discipleship process is purposeful, is intentional. It has to be designed. It's not by default. It's not de facto. You have to design it. And part of the purpose of designing is to cultivate. Cultivate what? Discipleship don't happen as lone rangers. They happen in communities. So we cultivate discipleship communities. Now, whether you call that discipleship group, cell group, small group, life group, doesn't matter. But the idea is to cultivate it. And what do we design the process to do? We design the process to create opportunities. Okay? Opportunities is different from creating programs. Opportunity is different from creating activities. Opportunities, you need activities, you need programs, you need all these things. But for the purpose of what? For the purpose of creating experiences that are shared. Now, a lot of these things, are very nuanced. Okay, so I won't spend too much time on this, but that's what I mean by a discipleship process. And so the process, the discipleship process, is a straightforward and ought to be a straightforward and strategic process that moves people. A process that does not move people is useless. By definition, a process is a progression, by definition. Now, the reason why I find it so important to talk about this is, as you attend the coming IDMC conference with Pastor Edmund Chan, he's going to talk about, rethinking discipleship. He's going to talk about the necessity for leadership in the discipleship process. And I'm going to leave it to Pastor Edmund to talk about the principles, the philosophy, the spiritual, the biblical aspects of all that. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the practical. Okay, and so the discipleship process, number one, is straightforward. Number two is strategic. And what it must do, it must move people. When I say move people, I don't mean just inspire people. When I say move people, it means we move people through stages of spiritual growth. That means we move people from a level of maturity to the next level of maturity to the next level of maturity. So there are four pillars. There are four pillars of a strategic IDMC process. Again, I covered this last year. I just want to remind us again so that I can go on to one particular portion of this process for tonight. Number one key pillar is clarity. The IDMC process must have clarity. It must be clear. What is clarity about? Clarity is about understanding. Second pillar there must be movement. What is movement? Movement is about change. Thirdly, in the IDMC process, there must be alignment. The IDMC process don't just happen individually. It doesn't just happen in a small group. It happens in a church. And that's what we're all trying to do. We're trying to build disciple-making churches. They are intentional, not disciple-making churches that happen to happen, but they are intentional. And for that to happen, the church and all its components and all its ministry have to align. And lastly, the last pillar is focus. Focus is about commitment. Once you have clarity, and once you design a process that's clear to everyone, and you manage to get the whole church with all its congregation, with all its different ministries, with all its different priorities aligned to this common process, then what you need to do, what we all need to do for this process to work is commitment, focus. Everybody from the board of elders to the senior pastors, to the pastors, to the ministry staff, to the admin staff, to the lay leaders, to the congregational members, young and old, we need to focus. We need to commit to that process. These are the 4 key pillars of an IDMC process. So what is clarity? Clarity is a clarity of the discipleship process to the people. A clarity of the discipleship process to the discipled people, the people that we are trying to disciple. That seems very obvious, right? If you can't, you go to the doctor, and the doctor, one of the things to test you, if you're past a certain age, in order to get your driving license, you need to be able to see this these set of letters, right? If you can't see, you can't drive. It's the same thing for the church. If we can't see and can't understand, we can't, as leaders, as pastors, we can't lead the church, and so on and so forth down the line. What is movement? Movement is about moving the people to be discipled towards one level of maturity to the next level of maturity, right? Moving a new Christian from being just a new Christian to one that understands what it means to be a Christian. From being understand what it means to be a Christian to one practicing the basic disciplines of reading the Bible and prayer. And then for someone who's been a Christian for 10 years, from someone who's sitting in the pews to someone who is part of CG life, part of discipleship community life, or from being part of community life to being an active part of that life by serving. All right. From that to one that's active not only in the church, but active wherever God has placed them. All right. To sharing. I do another talk on marketplace discipleship, to helping our lay people to understand that as a disciple in a marketplace, we carry 3 offices. All of us. 3 offices: the office of a prince or princesses, the office of a priest or priestess, the office of a prophet or prophetess. That's another talk altogether. And movement of people from one level of maturity to the next level of maturity. Then we need to align all of our ministries, from young people ministry to mature ministry, from a family life to CG, to whatever ministries that you might have, and align all that ministry to the process. In other words, every ministry within our church exists for the purpose of discipleship. That's alignment. Focus. Focus everything to the process. That means committing everything that you have. How you think, how the people that you have, the finances that you have, the structure that you have, focusing it to the process. Now, there's a reason why secular companies, companies like Google and Apple and Microsoft are so successful. In the corporate world, we don't talk so much about clarity, movement, alignment, focus, but the ideas are similar. In leadership training, there's 3 things that I do. We talk about leadership as a social process of direction, alignment, commitment. And once you find that a company have clear direction and the organization is aligned and people are committed, you find that you have a high performance environment. It's the same thing in the church. Unfortunately, church is complex, it can be difficult, even for something as simple in concept like clarity, movement, alignment, focus. Well, for tonight's session, I want to focus the next 20 minutes on clarity. Clarity of the discipleship process to the people being discipled. Why is clarity important? Because understanding always precedes commitment. Yeah? Understanding. Where we don't understand is hard to follow. You know, in parenting, it's the same thing. You know, there's an age of our kids where they grow up. There's an age where they keep asking, why that? Why this? Why that? You know, they're curious. So are young Christians in faith, whether they are young in age or older in age. There are a lot of questions in their heads. There are a lot of questions in their mind. And sometimes as parents, we are so tired of all the why questions. We say, can you don't ask why and just obey? Right? We are actually doing our children a disfavor. I recognize the benefit of it now that my kids are older. They are young adults now, young adults. And since the age of 10, 11 years old, I started talking to them about LGBT. So that was like 13, 14 years ago. And I remember my wife was very edgy about me talking about sex and LGBT with my kids and say, aren't we a little too young to talk about these things? I said, if we don't talk about it and help them to understand, Uncle Google will teach them. And I don't want Uncle Google to teach them. I want Daddy to teach them. And so now that they are young adults, we had a conversation about LGBT, conversation about sex, and they can articulate to me why sex is not a good thing. And it's not just because the Bible says so. I mean, sex before marriage. But they understand all the implication, they understand, and they are personally committed to it. Why? Because they understood. It's likewise in discipleship. In clarity, there is a pyramid of clarity. Sometimes we think, oh, just because as pastor we preach it, let's preach it over the pulpit, and immediately people will understand. Oh, it's clear as the sky. Not necessary. Well, the pyramid of clarity begins with vision, right? Everybody knows that. Where are we going? Vision is about the where, what the success look like. It's about the mission. Why must we go there, right? Everybody knows that, right? In leadership, talk about, oh, vision and mission. You must have vision and mission, and you must talk about it. You must inspire people. Yes, I agree. I don't disagree. But then what often we miss out is values. We forget about values. Values talk about what kind? What defines us as we are trying to get there? And there's something else that we churches often miss out. We talk about vision, where, mission, why, and values, what kind. We forget about the process. How do we get there? So people say, I'm inspired. I'm inspired by the vision. I'm passionate about the mission. Yes, I believe that these values, it must define us. And then we ask, how do we get there? And we say, okay, attend CG. How do we get there? Do your quiet time. How do we get there? Attend this Bible class. And people go, okay, I've been doing that, but how? And we don't answer that. And when we don't do that, a culture doesn't form. We forget about process a lot of the time. And guess what? We forget a process and we neglect values. Sometimes churches we get, oh, process. And we talk about process. And then we forget that process, to many people, sometimes they think process, they think work. How do we bring process to life? We must undergird process with values. the kind of church we want to be. So values and process go in hand in hand, and they are guided by our vision and our mission. You see, when we forget about process and values, when we don't place enough effort or enough emphasis and enough investment in values and process, what happened? We have vision and mission, but vision and mission stays on the church wall. I've gone to many churches to participate in activities, to preach, and so on and so forth. And I always see vision and mission on their wall. And yet sometimes when I talk to the people on the ground, they have no clue what vision and mission translate to, or they have no clue how do they get there. And then what happens? The culture becomes one of NATO, right? No action, talk only. Isn't that quite common in all our churches? And before long, IDMC becomes just another seminar, just become another fad. Whether is it purpose-driven church or whether is it, I don't know, you name it. In church kingdom, in the churchdom, there are many seminars, many fads, many kinds of trends. Why? Because we don't follow through some of these things on our values and process. Leadership is a process. We forget. Leadership is not just over the pulpit. Leadership is not just talking loud. Leadership is not just inspiration. Leadership is not just instructing people what to do. I learned 3 things from Pastor Ed about leadership. Leadership at the base level is about information, but the kind of leadership anybody can do. Leadership is about instruction, and that becomes dry and it doesn't really move people. But leadership is also about inspiration. And for leadership with the inspiration, we must understand that leadership entails process. And for leadership to be inspiring, leadership must be values-driven. Okay? So the pyramid of clarity requires a leadership that is process-driven and a leadership that's values-driven to communicate what those values are, to communicate what that discipleship process is, so that we can connect between the where we are going, what we are, why we are doing it, and connecting the dots for people, helping people to see how can we get there. So that once people understand, there is a level of commitment. Well, then I want to promote another idea, the other idea of staircase of clarity. Clarity is not just about these 5 dimensions, right? There is a progression of clarity. Number 1, clarity begins with personal clarity. You see, you can talk about IDMC all day long, disciple making all day long. But unless we make it personal, people can't see it. Most people don't have church at the top of their mind, right? You talk to any average churchgoer, the first thing on their mind in church, right? The first thing in their mind in church is what to have for lunch after church. You know, that's the first thing on their mind. They're not thinking about, wow, IDMC and how to win the world for Christ. They're not thinking about these things. They're thinking about, oh, what to feed my kids for lunch. You know, where am I going for lunch? You know, should I have a roasted chicken or roasted pork? And sorry to say that, right? But that's how spiritual we are as a church. And until and unless the clarity of discipleship process become personal, that means I believe I can change because God will change me. And as a church, as we lead the church, we need to help people see this is how God can, will, and must change me through the word of God. And IDMC talks a lot about that. Personal discipleship. Right? Discipleship begins at the personal layer. Then But you see, the issue is a lot of churches are so excited about IDMC, so excited about discipleship and disciple making, and they go back and they start talking to the church at large and say, oh, we got to do this, we got to change, and all those things. And we go organizational. Organizational talks about we, the church, can change, must change, and this is how we change. But you see, people might be enamored with the idea of the church changing, but when they look around, everybody else in the church, everybody else is thinking, what's for lunch after church? What's for lunch after church? And they're going, where is IDMC? Right? And it's difficult. The personal discipleship is what gives root and what gives grounding to the organizational. Then there's something very powerful about discipleship and disciple-making movement. And we forget that the disciple-making process is not just personal, and it's not just organizational, but what lubricates the disciple-making process within the church is that it is a social process. How do church people, how do lay leaders contribute and participate in the IDMC conversation within the church? In the latest and most contemporary thinking on leadership, and that is this: leadership is no longer just a top-down process. Leadership is no longer just about inspiration and telling people what to do. Leadership is no longer just about giving people carrot and stick. Leadership is now about being a social process that takes in consideration DEI or EDI, which is a very big thing in the Western world: diversity, equity, and inclusion. The very same idea apply in the church. These ideas of diversity, equity, inclusion are neither secular nor sacred. They don't belong to the what do you call that? They don't belong to the liberals alone. Right? The Bible and Jesus talk to us and teach us about what it means to include people, what it means to embrace diversity, and what it means to be equitable. The gospel is about that. It makes everybody equitable before God. And so it's a social process, and we forget that. We forget to leverage the sociality of discipleship and disciple making. And when we do that, it becomes cultural. So discipleship is not just a process or set of program. At the end of IDMC process is how can it becomes cultural. And we forget this social component. So leadership is a social process. Then there are phases of clarity. And here I want to use the epidemiological terms. When a disease breaks out, like COVID in the last 2-3 years, it started sporadic. Right? Sporadic means there are little outbreaks here and there. They are scattered and they are isolated. And that's our experience with COVID when we first started. Oh, we hear it here, we hear it here. They are just scattered. They are relatively isolated. Okay? Then the next phase of the disease becomes endemic. It occurs within an area. And in the case of in a church, it may occur within one particular ministry because a small group of people get very excited about discipleship. And there's a lot of buzz going on in that part of the church. But everywhere else in the church, oh, what's this group doing? Are they cults? What is happening here? You know, it becomes endemic. Endemic means it occurs within a specific area, within a contained area. Then it becomes an epidemic. It becomes widespread or wider spread. That's how COVID started. It started sporadic, became a little more endemic within specific areas, and then it became an epidemic. And then next thing we know, it became a pandemic. All right, it becomes a global spread, like what we experienced in these last 3 years. Likewise, in the church, as far as clarity is concerned. And finally, what we want is that we want it to be systemic. In other words, it becomes enculturated, like what's happening right now. COVID is entering a systemic phase. How many of you, well, if I ask you to raise your hands, how many of you have been infected by COVID at least twice already? All right, maybe more and more hands will go up. My wife has been infected twice. We think like in Singapore, my wife just reminded me, hey, Barney, the government is still measuring COVID infections, you know. I said, really? Are they still measuring it? He said, yeah, I'm measuring it every time. When we watch the news, the ticker at the bottom of the ticker, it says every day there are 10 over 1,000 infections. And these are only the reported ones because they go to the doctor and get medicine and the doctor report it. Right? There are many who are infected, very mild symptoms or without symptoms, and they're not even reported. So using the ideas of epidemiology on COVID, it's the same idea of clarity. The clarity of process often begins sporadically, you know. Only a few people get it. They understand. And then soon a small group of people begin to get it. And then there's a lot of life, there's a lot of passion, there's a lot of energy going in one sector, one part of the church. But what we want to do is that we want to get it to a point where clarity of the discipleship process begin to become more widespread. And then we want to get it to become a global spread within the local church, so that over time it becomes systemic, it becomes a culture. Leadership has to be systemic. Okay, leadership has to be systemic. And lastly, I just want to talk about crossing the clarity chasm. And here I'm borrowing from a book that has impacted me very deeply when I started my secular career. And the book is called Crossing the Chasm. It's written by Jeffrey Moore. It is about marketing. It's about how new products, when they enter the market, there are two phases to any product entering any market. There's the early market, and then there's a mainstream market. Okay, I don't have time to go into into a lot of examples, but you get it. Before iPhone became an iPhone, there was what's that phone that has a small little buttons? I forgot the name of the phone now.
Palm Pilot.
Yeah. After Palm Pilot, there's another one by Rim Motion.
BlackBerry.
When BlackBerry was king of the hill, iPhone was trying to enter. Right? iPhone was trying to enter. It's called the early market. And iPhone found a market with the enthusiasts, the touch screen, right? The swiping and the touch screen. So the early innovators started it. Then as Apple with all its marketing resources got into it, then you find that the visionaries, those who can see, those who can understand, wow, this is going to change the world. The world of the buttons, the small little screen button is not going to work anymore. This is going to be the world of the touch screen, of the swiping and all the apps. And people see the Apple ecosystem of application and wow, it's no longer just about security. It's no longer just about little buttons, you know. It's no longer just about the corporate world. BlackBerry was very strong in the enterprise world. And Apple took root in the consumer world. The early visionaries saw the impact of it. But you know what? If Apple was not careful, or if some of these companies were not careful, before Google was king of the hill, there were many other search engines out there. Remember, I used to use Alta Vista. I don't know where you remember. Those of you who are old enough might remember the search engine called Alta Vista. Alta Vista was like the king of the hill at that time. It was the best, you know, but Google was just trying to enter. And if you're not careful, you know, those who are trying to launch their product fall into the chasm, because between the early adopter and the early majority of the market, where it really takes off, there is a gap. There is a gap. And we have to be mindful of this gap. Likewise, when we're trying to bring IDMC into the church, you see, the enthusiasts, you have different enthusiasts in the church who attend the IDMC conference, who attend this conference, will come back and they get very excited. They get very excited, but they are sporadic. And then as they get excited, a few people hear and they get, wow, they caught it. Wow, this can really change the church. This can really change what it means to be the church of Christ. And then you find that the early visionaries are adopted. But most times in most churches, that's where it stops. That's where it stops. Because if we do not do it right in the church, many churches fall into the chasm. They fall right into it, and they never get to the early majority of the church, which are the pragmatists. Most churches are pragmatists, especially the church. Why? Because the churches, most churches in most countries are made up of the middle upper class income group. They have their life, they have their big houses, they have their big cars, they have their business, they have their profession, they are pragmatists. Change, they need to really experience and understand the how, not just the where and the why. Of course, they understand the where and the why. Who doesn't understand it? But they can't see, they're not clear. They don't understand, they don't know how to get from point A to point Z. And the church falls in the chasm, and IDMC becomes another one of those failed programs. So what needs to be done? You all know the Battle for Normandy in 1944, right? The Battle of Normandy begins on the beaches of Normandy, France in 1994, when the Allied forces of UK, USA, and Canada breach Normandy. They had 5 beachhead where they breached the shores of Normandy in 1944 and met the forces of the Soviets coming on the ground, on the land, coming in and drove out the Nazis. The determining factor for the Battle of Normandy was the beachhead, the breaching the beachhead. Likewise in the church, when we get to the point where you get early adopters, there's a small cluster of people that is endemic to them, this whole IDMC and this discipleship process. They understand it and they know it and they're excited. But for some reason, we can't get it across. You are in the chasm. And how do we cross the chasm? We got to understand what are the beachheads. What are the beachhead initiatives that we need to cross over to get clarity to the pragmatists? And once can get to the pragmatists, the early majority will adopt it. And when the early majority will adopt it, it's a matter of time because before the late majority adopts the discipleship process. And then in every church, there will always be the skeptics. You know what? For the skeptics, we shouldn't focus too much on the skeptics, because the skeptics will say, I shall not be moved. I will not be moved, and I don't want to move. For the skeptics, leave them be. Let God do the work. But our focus on the early and late majority, that will form about 80%, 70 to 80% of the church. Crossing the chasm. Leadership has to be strategic. So, for me to summarize, building a disciple-making church requires, begins, and sustains with clarity of vision, mission, values, and don't forget process. Clarity of process undergirded by values. Clarity. And the clarity of disciple-making process requires leadership. It just doesn't make sense to just preach it a few times, preach it, have a disciple-making month in church, preach disciple-making and discipleship, and there you go, and everything is clear. Yeah, it is very clear. It's clear as mud. we need to put into place a discipleship process. And that leadership is a strategic, social, systemic, values-driven process. It is strategic, meaning the moment you get to a place where you are in the chasm, where you find that you're going to fall in the chasm, you've got to be very strategic. You've got to make choices. Choices that align, choices that focus the energies of the church. It is social. We leverage the social networks within the church and have people participate in the larger IDMC conversation so that people begin to understand it for themselves. They talk about it. There's dialogue, there's exchange. There's a lot of questions and answer. You know, skepticism is being responded to. Questions are being encouraged. It is systemic. That means we don't just do it as a program, right? You do it across every level in the church, across every program, across every activity in every ministry within the church. And above all, it is values driven. Why is it values driven? Because values inspire. Process don't inspire. Process is what we need to have. But in the process is something that we do. We need to inspire people with the values of doing that process. Leadership is not simply tactical. Oh, let's do this activity. Let's do the activity. Leadership is not simply organizational. Oh, okay, let's structure the church this way. Let's create this ministry. Let's create that ministry. That's organizational. Important, and we must do that. Right? It is not just episodic. Oh, every year we devote this month to discipleship, this month to mission, this month to giving. That's episodic. For discipleship to happen in the local church, it has to be systemic across everything that we do. And it is not just activity-driven programs, but a values-driven process. So that's discipleship. Building an IDMC is a strategic, social, systemic, values-driven process. Thank you. I hope that is helpful for our exchange this evening.